Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, puck on. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.
Now, welcome back to Tip Today. Huge amount of text and WhatsApp coming in to us about Maggie there and her family, and lots of sympathy and condolences coming in for Maggie Butler as well. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio now by John G. O'Dwyer. Good morning to you, John.
Good morning, Fran. How are you?
This is the first in a series of kind of talks we're going to have, John.
Yeah.
Would you just sum up what we're going to do over the next while?
We're going to look, I think, at Irish history. And I suppose an awful lot of people, and I was in college and I was to teach heritage, and I'd say how many people liked history in school, and 3/4 would say no, it was very dry and boring. But what we're going to do, I think, over 8 episodes, we're going to look at all of Irish history, and what we're going to look for is the great stories, the stories about people. I'm trying to prove that history can be really interesting, and if at the end of the eight episodes, if people still think history is boring, then I have failed. But hopefully I won't think, and we're off air there, we were discussing some of the stories, and you're already seeing some of how interesting some of the stuff can be.
So I'm going to start really at the start with pre-Christian Ireland. Now give me a time scale on this. What are we talking about?
We're talking about when the first people came into Ireland. Now, there's no written evidence of that, but that would have been about 8,000 years ago. That's when we have evidence. Now, that's interesting because you would say Irish history has a very long history. Well, we do in some respects, but it's actually the shortest history in Europe because people came in to other parts of Europe much earlier. They came out of Africa about 100,000 years ago. They were in France 50,000 years ago. They only came into Ireland about 8,000 years ago. So why is that? And there's a very clear answer to that: the Ice Age. Ireland was covered in ice sheets up to about 10,000 years ago, so it wasn't habitable. So even the people in France, there was no Ice Age there, it was cold, but they still managed to survive. So it was only about 8,000 years ago, when the ice retreated, that these people actually came into Ireland. Now, we were then, during the Ice Age, we were attached to Scotland, and most people think, actually, they probably walked in. They came from Scotland all right, but they didn't, because once the ice melted, the sea levels rose, as you'd expect, and cut us off. So they probably came in canoes and longboats. But what's also interesting about this period is there is no written record. So if we look back to anyone from that period, Cú Chulainn, Fionn McCool, if they existed, the children of Lear, none of those people could read or write. Nobody could read or write. Reading, the ability to read and write, came in with Christianity in the 5th century to Ireland.
Right, but we were late to that,
We were late then, because mostly it was spread by the Roman Empire, and the Romans were in Britain for 600 or 700 years before that. They were spreading across Europe for about 1,000 years, and 'twas they brought the basis of oral language now, which is the Latin alphabet.
Right.
They brought that into those areas, but it came to Ireland then relatively late
because the Romans
because
didn't come
of
here, of
the
course,
ice sheets. That was
What environment did those first settlers come to here?
A terrible environment, really, and it was very difficult. So in other words, if one of the tip hurlers came in here and he was retired, he was around 35, you'd say a young fella. In those days, you'd say he'd have one leg in the grave. That would have been the thing about him. People lived, very, very few people would survive beyond 40. So why? What is Ireland like? It was covered in forests. Wolves and bears roamed the forests. And the people who came in were hunter-gatherers. They weren't farmers. They didn't settle down. And for a bit of safety, maybe, and to find their way, they stayed near the rivers. They stayed near the coast. They were probably largely afraid to go into the forests and that. And their life would have been very short. And when they ran out of food in one area, they moved on to another area, with the result that they left very little behind them. They lived in kind of tents that were made from animal skins.
Was this Stone Age?
Yes, well, it is. This is what you call, I don't want to getting into too much technical stuff, but this is what you call the Mesolithic period, when people were Stone Age and they were hunter-gatherers. And then we go to the Neolithic period, and this is when people settle down, and there's a huge change in society, and they become farmers, they become wealthier, and then they have the time and the ability to create great monuments in stone.
Okay, and tell us about some of those monuments, because we would know of many of them.
We know of many of them.
Yeah.
Maybe one that's less known but is very important, I think, is the Cage of Fields. The
Yes,
Cage of Fields.
of
Okay.
course.
Now, why is that important? Because what happened there was people obviously there, and they settled down and they set up field systems. But what happened then was, up in East Northwest Mayo, climate is fairly wet, it got wetter, and that created bogs. And gradually they were driven out because blanket bogs came in over all their fields. So the fields remained lost there for about 5,000 years, and then an archaeologist called Seamus Caulfield was on his own father's land, and he discovered these field systems. So he peeled back the bog, and there was the field system, one of the oldest field systems in Europe, and proof positive that about 4,000 years ago people had field systems. They were growing crops, and there was no native cows around. They had imported cows into Ireland as well as that, and of course cows and cattle became almost sacred animals. Think of the Tonbo Coigna, the prize bull of Ulster. The cattle were terribly important to the Celtic people. So that was the start, and then they became more sophisticated. They became a bit richer. They had better sources of food than the hunter-gatherers, and then for some reason, we don't know what the motivation was, they began to build huge monuments, and these monuments were mostly burial monuments. There's about 1,500 of them around the country, but one of the great ones, of course, is up at Newgrange. And history is circular, because what did these people do with their dead? They cremated them. Then when Christianity came in, the Christian philosophy didn't like that, and so people were actually buried and not cremated. And now history is a full circle. We're probably in a bit of a post-Christian society, and what do you find? That cremation is back again. It's fascinating. But just to say, we have examples of that in Tipperary as well. And I think, I don't know if you've heard about Knockrow.
Sure.
Yeah,
yes.
you've heard about
Yeah.
that. It's out near Grange Mokar,
Yeah.
and it's a megalithic burial site, and it's ahead of Newgrange. And I'll tell you why. It's not as big, but we have one up on Newgrange, because while the sun on the equinox shines in and illuminates the chamber in Newgrange in the morning, right? It does it in the morning and in the evening at Knockrow. And there's a big tradition now building up, and people gather there now,
right, yeah.
just as much as Newgrange, they gather there for the solstice as well.
What inspired those? Like Newgrange and the like. What inspired that? Because there are similarities to what was in England and Britain, was there not?
It's Stonehenge and that.
Yeah.
It's the question. We don't really know, and people are struggling with that. I suppose once you have food, clothing and shelter, you begin to think about putting meaning into life, putting ritual into life, and they seemed very important people. It seemed terribly important that they buried them. Of course, they would have believed in lots of gods that might have appeased the gods, that kind of thing. And they would also, people, after a while then, once they become a little bit better off, they create rituals, a kind of a bringing things together, and Newgrange would have been the ultimate. Now, the motivation, though, because remember, there was no horses in Ireland when they built Newgrange, so those thrones had to be all dragged in by humans, dragged up the hill. Might have been brought down the bind, but they had to be dragged up the hill. So when a guy is sweating and he's, on his last legs dragging these stones up, what's motivating to say, I saw this,
But you're all, and even still at this point, could they not read and write?
They could not, no, they could not.
So how did they do the mathematics?
That's what I don't know. How did they know exactly where the sun will rise on the 21st? Because they couldn't write it down so that you could pass it on to the next. Now, maybe what they would have done is they would have built some very simple monument pointing to exactly where the sun was on the, on the 21st, where it would be. They might have done that. But there's all these things.
But is it not much more precise than that, John?
Well, I
it's
suppose
very precise, isn't it?
Probably not, because remember, the thing is, everybody says it's on the 21st, but it's not as precise as that. I mean, the sun floods the chamber from about the 17th or 18th until about Christmas Day, if you were in there. It's not that precise. You get the biggest illumination on the 21st, so it's pretty precise. But you could, you can go in there on the 19th, and you might have much the same experience. But there's all these fascinating things, and I'm not an archaeologist or a historian in that sense of the word, but fascinating questions about our prehistory.
That's for sure. Will you stay with me, because I need to take a break. We'll be right back in just a few moments.
Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, puck on. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.
If it matters to you, it matters to us. Call Tip Today on 1800 938 007.
Now, you're very welcome back. John G. O'Dwyer is still with me. We're talking about pre-Christian Ireland. We're sort of up to the Bronze Age, I think, at this point, are we, John?
Yeah, and that's a huge change.
Yeah.
Because it's the first time up to that you're working in stone. There's not so much you can do with stone. All you can do is cut down stone, sharpen it and that. But now you can, with metal, you can create exactly what you want with a mould. So if you have a mould of a dagger, you can create 100 daggers. And that means then, and this kind of then bronze, it's a lot better. It works a lot better than stone. It's much sharper. So it would have been easier. At this stage now, what you're finding is people are beginning to control their environment. So the great forests are being cut down in Ireland and to create farmland. And that then is helped very much by the coming of bronze. So you can have better access. But not only that, then people are getting that little bit richer. So they begin to think about their status. And one way then is, I know an interesting thing. Have you ever thought about it? You know the way gold, people go around the world and they almost kill each other. They have been killing each other for centuries over gold.
Sure.
Gold is actually the most useless of all metals.
It's a soft metal, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's
Yeah.
completely soft. You
Yeah.
can do nothing with it. But what you can do is you can use it for ornamentation. And therefore they seem to be using collars and clasps and pins and necklaces. And they seem to be used to denote status. There was some kind, like, people do tend to create a pecking order and people like to show off. So the nearest thing you can say to that today, which I don't have, but you probably have, Fran, a Rolex watch.
Oh,
You come in and flash the Rolex watch. My old Timex is here, never mind. So I'll be in the bottom.
So it was a
there.
status
It's the
symbol,
Rolex
so
watch.
to-
It's
yeah.
that kind of thing. It's the branded stuff. We created some wonderful. In fact, a lot of people don't think of it. In the Bronze Age, probably the best goldsmiths were in Ireland. But of course, a lot of the stuff was lost, and I'll tell you why. Because when it was rediscovered in the medieval period, people were poor. So you saw an old gold collar. That's not much good. But I could sell this as gold, turn it into something else. So you brought it to a goldsmith, and they melted it down and paid you for it. So a lot has been lost, but there is still a lot of it around. Beautiful stuff. We'll say the Boris No collar now. That was found up on the Devil's Bitch. The time we nearly killed you up the Devil's Bitch. Well, it wasn't too far from there. Try not to remember it. That's the sort of thing that you have. The Boris No collar was found there all over the country in the National Museum. And most people think, all the time they look at the Derrynna Flan chalice, the Arda chalice, the Cross of Cong, and that as the great examples of artistry in Ireland. But go back to the Bronze Age, some of the most superb workers in gold were in Ireland, and whatever seemed to motivate them was, it was the people who wanted status, and these people then were buried with their gold.
So obviously pre-Christian. So who did they look to in terms of who did
They'd have a multitude of gods, and you would, they would the monotheists. They would polytheists.
Yeah.
And Christianity was monotheist. So they were polytheists. They would have all kinds of gods, and the main thing was then that you had to appease the gods with offerings because they could strike you down. A thunderstorm to them would seem like the gods getting angry, and they could strike you with lightning.
But something you told me off air that really I found very interesting. They didn't believe in an afterlife.
Well, not in eternal life. Sometimes they would believe that the spirit of some of their leaders and that would continue on, and that's probably suggested why they considered them. But that's why Christianity maybe became so powerful and swept across Europe, because it has an afterlife for everybody. And the idea, very compelling idea, that we will all meet our loved ones again, like Maggie, who was in before us, if you know what I'm speaking about. She will meet Alex again. So that's compelling.
Very
but
powerful,
that wasn't there at that stage. So you had that was the Bronze Age, and it was, it's probably a neglected age then. And then what you had then was the coming of the Celts, and they changed things hugely.
Okay.
Because
where did they, just for clarity, where did they come from?
they came mostly from Central Europe.
Right.
Yeah, they were Central Europe. But it may have been that they were pushed out of Asia Minor because of other groups like the Vandals and the Huns coming in behind them and taking their land, that they were pushed west.
And what influence did they have on us then?
They had a huge influence. One I love myself is the one because they brought us in the Irish language. And the Irish language then is about 2,500 years old in Ireland. Whereas you compare it with the English language, there's so much talk about it. Recognisable English language probably goes back to Chaucer about 1,000 years ago. So it's a much older, and of course I would say, much more mellifluous language as well, and something we should certainly treasure. But they brought in iron as well, and that's a much better metal than bronze. It makes much better weapons, so they were much better at chopping people's heads off, so they became...
So the Iron Age.
Yeah, they had the Iron Age. They became the top dogs in society. That was the thing. The Celts became dominant here in this country.
Right.
And the other... Sorry, go ahead, you were saying.
No, I was just going to say, when they came, were they violent towards the settler, the people who had settled? But, I mean, did they come with a view to attack these people and take their land and stuff?
I said we were taught in school there was a Celtic invasion.
Yeah.
But it probably wasn't. They probably bled into the country. Now, I'm sure, like people who came later than the Normans and the Cromwellian settlers, they kicked people off their land at times. That's what people do. But there wasn't a whole, it wasn't like the Normans where a whole army ended up below in Wexford and started to conquer the country. We were trading. They would have found out about Ireland, been forced in here, and they would have brought in the Irish language, and that became the dominant language. There was some language here before, but nobody knows what it was. Because if we get back to it again, nothing could be written down. But they brought in this language. Now, probably picked up some of the old words. Do you know the way in English we still have Peugeot?
Sure, yeah,
so they would have picked up, make a very, very rich language as well as that. But then in this period, the pre-Christian period, of course, what you have is the great myths of Ireland. That's it. So the great myths...
What, your Cuchulainns and all?
Yeah, the Cuchulainns. That's all from the Iron Age. Satanta, Cuchulainn, Fionn McCool, the Fianna, the Red Branch Knights, the Children of Lear, Lowry Lynchick, all of these people, the kings of Ireland, they're all written down in the great annals of Ireland. Now, they couldn't be written at the time. They were written later because, again, as you say, couldn't be written at the time because we had no way of writing. So that was it now. And a lot of people then, it's written in the Christian time. So you can see this thing is these people were pagan. But to kind of have a happy ending, then you'll find some of these stories, like Oisin as an old man comes back to Ireland, but he meets St. Patrick and he's baptised. So it's the happy ending. That, there will be an afterlife for these people. And then you have the Children of Lear as well, and they meet some holy man and he baptises them as well. So they're guaranteed eternal life. So we see the coming of
I would ask this, wouldn't I, with my other hat on me, was there music? Was there dance? Was there music?
Well, to be honest with you, was there... the human thing would be that there would be celebrations. There would have been, celebrations and that kind of thing. I'd say, generally speaking, what you're talking about is more formalised musical instruments.
Yeah.
So I'd say that would have come in mainly with the Celts and in the Iron Age. Yes,
right.
that kind of thing. But, would people have had an impulse to sing, to come together and come... the main thing to remember about all these people is the circumstances are very different. But these people have exactly the same motivations, the same brain, the same fears, the same desires, the same want for social status and that we have in the modern world. Just their circumstances are different.
It might seem like a stupid question because I'm still finding it hard to place where we are just in terms of the years. Would there have been the beginnings of towns and cities? Nothing like that?
No, there would be nothing. In fact, what you're talking about are the only thing, what people had lived in the Iron Age is the ring forts. A whole family would have lived there, and then at times of war they were continually stealing each other's cattle. They would drive the cattle in there, and they would generally be on high ground. They would be defensive, and all those forts are still around. And of course, why? Because people still believe in that the fairies. And in fact, I'll tell you a very quick one. I was teaching heritage one time. I took a group out to show them a ring fort. I said, there's who lives in there now? They're all still around. The ring forts are mostly there because people are afraid to touch them because they're afraid of the fairies. And I said to all this group, 20, like, any of you believe in fairies? I said, what? Fella, 6 inches high. Jeez, we always thought this fellow was losing his marbles, he was losing it. And then I said to one of the biggest strong fellas who kind of the hurling team and that, okay, you don't believe in fairies, you go in there and break off an old branch and bring it out to me. He looked at me, do you think I'm cracked or something? So it's still there. We still believe there is something out there, like the gods in the old days, that if we annoy the gods, they can destroy us.
So you say we're still influenced? to some degree by our pre-Christian
I think we are. Yeah, I think we
heritage
are. Yeah, I think the gene is still there. I was amazed, and I asked classes afterwards, and afterwards, just we went out to the ring for it and said to them, and they all didn't believe in it. Then they said, no, I wouldn't go in. No, that'd be a very bad idea. And that's great because it preserves our heritage, of course, and that kind of thing. But these weren't, obviously fairy forts. This is where they live. So there were no towns and cities. The first things that you might recognise at a town were monastic sites. The first things. So Clonmacnoise and that, and they came in at Christianity. But if you're talking towns, we'll be talking that later on in the series. Then you're talking about the Vikings, and the Vikings created Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Cork, and most of they were nearly all coastal towns.
And before we leave this, I mean, we're still talking about a small population of people,
very small population,
okay.
Yeah.
And still forests.
They were
everywhere.
beginning to disappear now, particularly towards the end of the Iron Age. There was an awful lot of deforestation in Ireland. Nobody ever knows. And of course, there was no census. But I'd say coming up to the time of Christianity, you might have 100 to 200,000 people living in Ireland. You were very small, and they would have been widely dispersed from each other, population. Right. So when Patrick came in, he'd have to walk from one place to another. So you can see then in Cashel, the Onacht were there in Cashel, but you can see a whole circuit of ring forts around them, going out to my own Boherlahan and Dachiamall, and that's probably where then the community of the Onacht.
Interesting. Were we seagoing? Were there vessels for trade going back and forth?
No doubt about it, because you can see stuff that was imported. Stuff has turned up in pre-Christian Ireland that came from as far away as Turkey. So there are more sophisticated people. It was very dangerous and that kind of thing. But boats would have traded with Britain, they would have traded with France. That's where we got the tin that produced the bronze as well as that. So, absolutely. But that's how and that eventually then is how Patrick came to Ireland as well as that, because not only were they going over to trade, they were going over to grab slaves as well. As the Roman Empire couldn't defend itself, it was falling apart, and that's how Patrick, in his own words anyway, ended up in Ireland as a slave.
Isn't it absolutely?
We'll be dealing with Patrick the next day.
All right, very good indeed. So that was our pre-Christian episode there, and as I say, we'll go from St. Patrick, which I'm really, really interested in that, because there's so much myth surrounding Patrick. You're going to sort out some of that.
I'll try as best I can. The one thing is we're certain he existed, and of course the one thing is he's the first person to have written in Ireland, so we have his own words. But he's not a bit like the avuncular figure. He's like all the rest of us. He struggles with his own morality, and he struggles with where he wants to go, and he's sad a lot of the time.
Very good indeed. All right, John, pleasure as always. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for me. Leanne produced, Ellie looks after our content, and Stephen has the time tunnel on the lunchtime show. The finalist in our Pints in a Field competition with the two Johnnies is Owen Myers from Cloheen. Well done to you, Owen, and I'm sure you will we wish you the very best luck in the final on Friday. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, Puckon. Main Peugeot dealers in the Premier County. And now stocking the full range of the luxury French car brand DS Automobiles. Book your test drive today with Slattery's Garage, Puckon. See slatterysgarage.ie.